20,000 men built it, the most transformative infrastructure project in American history, 1,776 miles of iron rail across plains, desert, and granite mountain. A line that cut the travel time from coast to coast from 6 months to under 2 weeks. A line that connected a fractured nation, opened the West, and made the fortunes of the men whose names are on every history book page about it. The men who actually built it are not on those pages, not most of them. Not the 20,000 who did 90% of the hardest work, the tunneling, the blasting, the hauling through 40 feet of Sierra Nevada snow. Not the men who handled nitroglycerin when engineers were afraid to. Not the men who drilled 1,659 feet through solid granite with hand tools and black powder and no safety equipment and no legal protections and no way to go home. 1 in 10 of them died on the Sierra Nevada leg alone. Nobody counted the rest. The railroad companies kept no official record of Chinese worker deaths. The bodies of those killed in avalanches weren't found until the spring thaw, sometimes months later, sometimes never. What the railroad kept meticulous records of was money. And on that subject, the books are very clear about who got paid and who did not. Before we go further, if this kind of railroad history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around real American locomotives, real engineering decisions, and the real stories behind the iron highways that connected this country. If that's the kind of history worth preserving to you, the subscribe button is how you tell us, and we want to hear from you. Did you work the railroads as an engineer, a fireman, a conductor, a machinist, a dispatcher? Did a father or grandfather spend their career on the high iron? Did you grow up in a railroad town? Cheyenne, Altoona, Sparks, Topeka, Collinwood? Leave it in the comments. The people who actually work these locomotives and these routes know things no archive has ever recorded. We want to hear from them. Now, back to the railroad. In 1864, a Chinese worker on the Central Pacific earned $26 a month. He paid for his own food, his own tools, his own lodging. His Irish counterpart on the Union Pacific earned $35 a month and had every one of those costs covered by the company. Same iron, same mountain, same result. The Central Pacific had tried to build without them. In 1864, the railroad had laid exactly 50 miles of track. The job ad seeking 5,000 workers had produced a few hundred responses. White laborers walked off the job to chase silver in Nevada the moment the mines opened. Charles Crocker, the Central Pacific's construction superintendent, hired 50 Chinese workers from nearby mines in desperation. He had been told they were too small, too weak, too foreign for the work. Within weeks, Crocker had ordered 15,000 more. They came from Guangdong province, from villages where $1 a month was prosperity. They came in gangs led by Chinese contractors, organized by specialty, graders, tunnelers, blasters, masons. They built retaining walls that are still standing. They hand-drilled the Summit Tunnel through pure granite at the pace of 8 inches a day. In winter, they lived inside the mountain, tunneling through snow from camp to face, sleeping in chambers under 40 feet of drifts, emerging in spring to find their companions frozen where they had fallen. Nobody expected them to last. Nobody expected them to strike, either. On June 19, 1867, a tunnel blew too early. 1 white worker and 5 Chinese workers were killed in the explosion. 3,000 workers laid down their tools 5 days later and stayed out for 8 days. It was the largest labor action in the United States up to that point. They demanded $40 a month. They demanded a 10-hour workday in the open air, 8 hours underground. They demanded the right to leave a job site they found dangerous. Crocker cut off their food. After 8 days, they went back to work. None of their demands were met. Over the following months, wages quietly improved, not to parity, but enough to keep them on the line. The railroad needed them more than it admitted. By May 1869, the Central Pacific had laid 690 miles of track from Sacramento to Promontory Summit in Utah. The Union Pacific had come 1,086 miles from Omaha. The two lines had actually built past each other in the race for government land grants before Congress intervened and designated Promontory as the meeting point. On May 10th, Stanford and Durant drove the ceremonial golden spike into a polished laurel tie. Telegraphs transmitted the signal to every major city in the country. Bells rang in Philadelphia. Cannon fired in New York. The Chinese workers were not in the photograph. They were not invited to the ceremony. Their names are not in the telegram. The men who drilled the Summit Tunnel, who carried nitroglycerin down mountain passes, who built the line that made Leland Stanford's fortune, they were gone before the celebration started. 13 years later, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The men who built the railroad were now legally barred from becoming citizens of the country they had built it through. The law stayed on the books for 60 years. If this is the kind of railroad history you want to keep watching, subscribe to the channel. There are more locomotives, more forgotten experiments, more untold stories from the steam and diesel era still to document. And if you have a connection to what you just heard, a grandfather who ran one of these engines, a father who worked the roundhouse, someone who was on the footplate when this era was still running, tell us in the comments. What did they operate? Which road? Which run? The men who drove these locomotives didn't leave many records behind, but the people who knew them are still here. We want to hear from them. Meanwhile, what the railroad had actually cost was becoming clear. The Credit Mobilier of America, a construction company secretly owned by Union Pacific executives, had billed $94 million to build a railroad that cost $50 million. The missing $44 million had gone into the pockets of Durant, Ames, and their associates. $9 million in discounted stock had been distributed to congressmen to ensure no federal oversight. Vice President Schuyler Colfax took shares. The Speaker of the House took shares. The investigation named 13 congressmen. Nobody went to prison. The workers who built the railroad took home $26 a month. The executives who billed for it took home $44 million. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Labor inducted the Chinese railroad workers into its Hall of Honor. The citation notes that their contributions laid the foundation for the extraordinary economic prosperity enjoyed by the United States in the years that followed. There is no official count of how many of them died doing it. The Summit Tunnel is still in use. The track through the Sierra Nevada still carries freight. The mountains did not move for the railroad's executives. They moved because 20,000 men who will never have a ceremony put their hands on the granite and refused to stop. The golden spike is in a museum in Washington. The men who made it possible have no monument on the line. The iron is still there. Besides,